Welcome to another edition of the Pulpit Show. I'm Mark Joseph, and my guest today is John Marks. He's the author of a book called Reasons to Believe.
Yes.
And also a new documentary film called Purple State of Mind. John, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be here.
Well, you've been a busy guy, video, movies, and books. First, let's start with the book. Talk to me about the book and what is it about and the journey you've been on.
So a few years ago, I was working for a producer as a producer for Morley Safer at 60 Minutes, and we decided to do a story about the Left Behind books by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. A fictionalization of a certain interpretation of the end time, the prophecies about the end time, and we sought out readers of the books to tell us why they liked them so much. So I went to my hometown, Dallas, Texas, to do the auditions for those readers because Tim LaHaye was going to come through Dallas for a prophecy conference. And I sat down for an hour with a couple called Don and Lily McQuinney, whom I had met through a pastor in Denton, Texas. And I asked them questions for about an hour about their beliefs, about the books, about why they liked the books, and how their books tied to their beliefs, and they answered. And then Don McQuinney, the husband, turned to me and said, "You've asked us a lot of questions, now may I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Will you be left behind?" Now, for a lot of people who are in my world and in my walk of life and my profession, they wouldn't have known what that question meant exactly. But I'd read some of the books, and I knew from my own religious upbringing that what he was saying was, have you been saved? Have you been redeemed by the grace of Jesus Christ and His sacrificial offering? And I was flummoxed a little bit. You know, was supposed to be an audition for him. It wasn't supposed to be me. But so I said, yeah, I'm going to be left behind, and I didn't tell them anything about my own past, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But when I walked out of there, a couple of things occurred to me. One is there was a time in my life when I would have asked that question of somebody. I was a born-again Christian at the age of 16, and I didn't really talk about it much anymore. But his question was incredibly familiar to me, even though it also felt kind of presumptuous, and it had antagonized me. So there were those two warring impulses that resulted in my thinking, okay, he's asked this question, and it's obviously bothered me a little bit. Why has it bothered me? What does it mean that it has bothered me? Maybe I should really try to answer it instead of just kind of dismissing it. And answer it, though, as a professional, as a writer, as a novelist, with all sort of every part of my being, as a means of trying to talk a little bit about what it means to be an evangelical Christian in this day and age. Because all around me at that time, people I knew were asking me, what is this? What's going on? What is this? What does the Passion of the Christ mean, the Mel Gibson movie? What's that all about? Who are the people who are going to that? 2004 elections. What's going on? Who are the people who are voting for the president, for President Bush and all those numbers? So there was an element of this that was very much tied to that moment, but it began with that personal experience, auditioning those people for 60 Minutes.
Did you say you answered the question to them?
The question, I did answer them, but I answered them by saying, I will be left behind.
And that was it. What did they say?
They said, why? And I said, because I don't find Jesus Christ to be a plausible explanation or an adequate explanation for the totality of experience on earth. He's an interesting and amazing figure, but not and as far as I'm concerned, the Messiah or a Messiah. Then the wife said to me, what about sin? And I said, well, it's an interesting term or concept. Maybe it means death, or it can mean a lot of things. She said, no, I mean your sin. And I felt, I say in the book, I felt like a kid basically caught with a cigarette in the bathroom. I was like, oh, my sin. Well, and she said, well, for instance, my great sin was fear. And I couldn't conquer my fear. And I tried to do it. It wasn't until I got on my knees and gave my life over to Christ that my fear left me and my sin was removed. And that particular sin I could deal with. So that was incredibly moving to me because just talking with her very superficially, I saw a lot of pain in this woman's life. I found out later what it stemmed from, but at that moment it was pure intuition. And I could see there was a certain fragility to her and in her eyes, sometimes you can tell when someone has a bit of sorrow that hangs over them or is in them. And I could see that in her. And so when she said that, I knew that she was, her experience of Christ was probably, was redemptive, at least in that way. That was another reason why I sort of felt like, okay, these people answered my questions for an hour, and I put the husband on television. And so he talked about the Left Behind series on television. And all this just stayed with me, and I knew that that little 13-minute segment from Morley Safer was not going to be enough for me to deal with both the personal implications and the larger picture of what this meant for the country.
But you call your book Reasons to Believe.
Right.
And what does that mean? How does the title relate to the book?
Well, I am no longer a believer, but I have tried to argue in this book, and would argue before I even started this book, that there are reasons for people to believe. In other words, a lot of people, I think, in this country, maybe not as many as believe, but there are a lot of people who say, how can you even think that? How could you possibly believe in a God that, for instance, has a plan for the end of the world and created the world in the way that the Bible says? How can you possibly believe that? How can you believe that someone like Jesus Christ died and rose again to redeem humankind from itself? You know, how can you possibly think that? That's ignorant, it's weak, it's foolish, whatever. And so part of what I wanted to do was say, there are reasons. All of these people, they have their reasons to believe these things. I wanted it to be a book also that believers could reach for and find something in, so they could find a conversation. So I didn't want something that in any way smacked of Hitchens or Sam Harris or this kind of negative, total assault on Christianity. And at the same time, I didn't want to convey, I think just like you, this is a book by one of you about us. So it was a difficult book to title. And for years, it was called Among the Evangelicals. But I hated that title because it sort of sounded like a bug under glass book, and I didn't like that. And the thing that finally turned it was this Bruce Springsteen song, Reasons to Believe. At the end of every hard-earned day, people find some reason to believe, is a line in that song, and I thought that's what I want to lead with.
What are some reasons people believe?
Some people believe, I think, because they come to a point in their life where they can no longer function, they can no longer see a way forward in both their material prospects and in their emotional lives, and they have heard about Jesus, but they have never actually been told by anyone who's had an experience of transformation that Jesus is more than just the head of a religion or the figure in a religion. They haven't ever been told that Jesus is actually can be a living figure and can step into your life, and when they hear that, it comes as just an explosion, a kind of spiritual explosion. Oh, that's what that's about. And all of a sudden, they walk across a line where they couldn't solve any of their own problems. They couldn't solve their financial problems. They couldn't solve their personal problems at home. They couldn't deal with their kids. And all of a sudden, that piece of information somehow gets them across a line where they can have some perspective on their own person and on their own problems and begin to function. I've seen that many, many times, and I think that transformation is completely real. When people say that Jesus transformed their lives, that happens.
Sort of like they acquired a life coach.
They acquired a life coach. In some cases, it is just that. But then the next thing I think that happens is some people intellectually sort of think a lot about these things. They care about questions of being. They care about questions of where it all began. Why is there life? Why do I think? You know, they may not even come across as the most intellectual people in their social circle, but they think a lot about these things, and they can never quite let that, they keep scratching that itch. And so Jesus comes along into the picture as a kind of key, a beginning of a way to really think through all of these large questions and line them up in order and say, wait a second, I think now I can take these puzzle pieces that have kind of tormented me and put them all together. So there's an intellectual component here that I think is also transformative for some people, that doesn't necessarily have to result from a broken life or somebody who hasn't been able to figure things out. These can be very successful and fairly contented people, but they simply cannot let go of the idea that there's something larger and greater and deeper in existence than their own material needs or their own small personal pleasures. And the story of Christ and salvation and what it says about death and how it connects them to then the beginning of the universe and the end of the universe. There's something about that I think is immensely satisfying and even pleasurable for somebody of an intellectual bent. Not for lots of people, but for certain people, it's a deep pleasure of life to discover in that story a kind of huge sea of intellectual possibility that they maybe never saw because they thought, oh, religion, it's not for me. Those are a couple of reasons.
Okay. We'll be back in just a minute with our guest, John Mark. Stay tuned. We're back on the Pulpit Show. We're talking to John Marks about his movie and his book, Reasons to Believe. What was it like with the process of the book? Did you go and do a whole round of interviews again with some of the folks you'd visited during your 60 Minutes time? What was that like?
Yes, I did. It was an incredible experience because I'd never done any reporting like it. I went in and I had to kind of make clear to everybody I talked to my story, because I didn't want them thinking, I didn't want to come in and say, I was once a Christian and not explain why I wasn't anymore. I didn't want to ever say to anybody, I'm still a Christian when I wasn't. At the same time, once I said that I wasn't a Christian anymore, everybody wanted to know why, how did that happen? With McQuinney's, I went back to them very early on, one of the first interviews I did, and we sat down to dinner, and that was kind of a shocking experience. Not the dinner, but what happens shortly after. We got together, no tape recorder, I didn't take any notes, and they told me their story. And part of their story is they have a bipolar son named Ted, who at the time that we met was basically missing. He had started out without any kind of bipolar disorder, and about the time he was in his late 20s, it began to afflict him, and it got worse and worse and worse, and they had tried not to commit him. He had tried to kill himself many times, and they listed all the ways he'd tried to do it, but they just didn't want to commit him. They didn't want to kind of close the door on that. So they had finally got him into a halfway house. This was a well-educated guy who was going to do AIDS research. He was a doctor, and by the time that I met them, he was no longer able to function very well at all, and they had him in a halfway house, and he'd been kicked out of the halfway house because not even that worked. He'd come to their home late at night, pounding on the door, asking to be let inside, and they hadn't done it because it was violent and angry and obscene language that he was using. And then he'd left. And when we met, they said, we don't know where Ted is, but we assume he's somewhere in the greater Dallas area in a homeless shelter. And I told them a little bit more about myself and about where I was. And we agreed to meet on this next Sunday morning, it was a Friday night. We would meet on Sunday morning and go to church together, to their church. So on Sunday morning when I showed up, they gave me a Bible. We got into their car. We headed down the highway. And Don turned to me and said, I have some news for you, John. Our son, Ted, was killed yesterday. So 5 hours after we had the conversation where I had come back to talk to them for the book, he was walking up the on-ramp of a highway in Dallas and was hit by a car and killed instantly. All right? So when I showed up then, all of a sudden and their other two sons, one was in China, he's a missionary, and the other was in London, so they couldn't be there. So I was the only person to sit with them in the pews and to go through this with them. And I wanted out of that car, frankly. I just said, why didn't, I said, I don't want to be here doing this when you're going through this. I was shocked, and didn't know what to do. And Don said, look, just be with us. Just sit here and be with us, and it will help us, and that's all. And that's, it's not bad that you're here. So I went to church services with him where the pastor announced to the congregation that Ted had died. And I spent a few hours that day with him. I went to the funeral. And that was the beginning of this book in some ways. I had left 60 Minutes at that point. And so it was the first reporting trip for the book. And I had thought from the beginning that I would use my personal story, but that I would have a measure of detachment professionally. You're going to go and do this, but it's mostly going to be reporting with a personal angle. But from that moment on, I was sort of fully implicated in it. It was going to be much more personal because my relationships with all of these characters in the book were going to get more personal. And that was just a first example.
How did your journey of faith happen? You were reared in the Presbyterian Church in Dallas.
Right.
And was there a moment, C.S. Lewis talks about he got into a car and he was a non-believer and he came out and he was a believer. There was this kind of a moment. Was there a moment when you turned from belief to non-belief, or wherever you would describe yourself now?
I don't remember that moment. I've looked back in my journals and I write all the time about Jesus and my faith and about God, but I can never find that moment and I can't remember it. I think it happened at a Young Life meeting in North Dallas.
A Young Life meeting?
Yeah, a lot of these meetings, Young Life would come to school and they wouldn't actually talk to you there about Christ, but what they would do is say, come to our Young Life meeting on Monday nights, and if you're interested, come some more. So I went with some friends, and I think at some point after, say, 5 or 6 visits, they do a kind of altar call, which is not as kind of big and it's not as big a moment as it would be in church, but it's sort of, listen, if anybody wants to come forward and say they've accepted Christ as their Savior or want to give it a try, come on up. And I'm almost certain that's where it happened, but I don't have the memory of that. But it was a transformational moment for me. It truly was. That's one reason I went back to do the book. I wanted to ask myself, what was it? Was it fad? Did you just fall into something in high school and then ditch it as soon as you got out? But I think it was more than that. I go back and I look at my journals and I talk to people who knew me back then, including someone like Craig, who I met in college.
This is Craig Detweiler,
Craig
who you did the
Detweiler,
film with.
who I made the film with. And so what I can remember having a particular verse from Matthew, consider the lilies, they toil not, they spin not. That verse from Matthew was one that I kept with me in my back pocket, and I memorized it not just because it was a verse that I wanted to memorize and impress people with. It was the kind of thing that answered me the question of why I believed. It was the thing that allowed me to get over my high school anxieties. Why don't the girls I like me? Why is it that I'm not as good at sports as some other people? Why is it that I don't feel like I'm connected to other people in school? Why is it that I feel like such an outsider in my own family? All those things, that verse was kind of the beginning of helping me feel confident and secure in the world. And that lasted for a while, but at a certain point, I began to ask myself whether, and this happened in college, and the year that I roomed with Craig Detweiler, my sophomore year, was the year when these questions really began in earnest. I began to ask myself, what are you giving yourself? What are you endowing yourself with if you say that Jesus Christ, is the Lord of all time and space and came to redeem all our sins, and He's come to you and saved you, and so many others are not going to be saved, who haven't made that same choice? What does that mean? What are the ethical implications of that? And how are the people around you who have the same salvation that you have behaving? Are you impressed with how they're behaving? Do they strike you as more or less moral than the other people you know who are not saved, or who you don't think are saved, or don't talk about it? And all those questions began to bubble and boil. By the time I was 30 years old, I no longer believed that Christ was my personal Savior, but I still believed in God. And while I was a reporter in the Balkans in that era, I had an experience that pretty much shattered that last remnant of my born-again faith.
So where would you describe yourself now? Would you say you're an agnostic or an atheist or something in between, or neither?
I'm so uncomfortable with the words. Atheist seems to commit me to certain company and to sort of certain approach to all these questions that I find too restrictive. I'm a novelist right now, first and foremost. That's really what I do mostly for a living. And I sort of, for the key to that is an imaginative empathy and sympathy and an ability to think outside of myself and to put myself into others' places and to simply say there is no God, and I happen to know it categorically. So I can't really take that position.
Because there might be.
Well, it's not so much that there might be, it's that a lot of people believe it, and I don't know. I have no information on that subject, right? Ultimately, I have no information on whether or not there's a God. I don't think it's necessarily incumbent on me to answer whether there's a God. I just can't see it. But I hesitate to say, I happen to know absolutely for sure there is no God. Even Dawkins, I saw the other night on Bill Maher, Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist, won't say categorically, absolutely there is no God, because he is wary of doing something unscientific, which is making a statement he can't completely prove to his satisfaction. But for me, so then that leaves me in the agnostic category, but frankly, I don't even know. That also commits me to something that I'm not sure.
You don't know that you don't know.
I don't know that I don't know, right. So I'm restless with those terms, but I think that the closest would be agnostic, but that implies that I definitely think there's something out there, or I leave open that possibility. I suppose I leave open that possibility. That's about the most I can say.
I'm sure in these travels you've been on, you've had different people witness to you, talk to you about their faith. What do you find the most helpful and the most annoying when religious people explain their beliefs to you and try to convert you?
Well, I can start with the most annoying. The most annoying is when somebody comes to me with a story that's right out of a pamphlet, and it doesn't seem to in any way involve them personally, but is a playbook move. So the other, let's see, it's been about 3 weeks ago.
4 spiritual laws, those kinds of things.
Let Go and Let God, if you've heard that one. That one, I was hit with that one in Texas a few weeks ago. And a woman stood up at a screening of our movie, the movie Purple State of Mind, and we talked with audiences afterwards. And she said, I think if you just let go and let God, you'd find that a lot of these a lot of the questions you have would be answered very quickly, and those that wouldn't, you wouldn't care that much about. And that one just really annoyed me, because I just feel like, you know what, come on, don't belittle the intellectual effort to understand the world. Don't say you have to put your mind over here in order to get this. If God is real, I should be able to, my intellect should be part of the equation. So that's one. Another one is a story, kind of the stories that are kind of rote stories. You know, there's a guy in the water who's drowning, and 3 boats come, and he says, no, don't worry about me, God will save me. Mm-hmm. And then when he finally drowns, he meets his maker and says, God, why didn't you save me? And God says, I sent you 3 boats. Mm-hmm. So those kinds of stories, I think, don't do justice to the faith, and they don't require much work on the part of the person who's witnessing. They're sort of lazy. The stuff that impresses me most is the simple relation of what this experience of faith has meant in someone's life at the most basic level. At the same place where someone gave me the boat analogy, a woman stood up. She was probably 19 or 20 years old. She could hardly articulate herself, but she was talking about what happens in her church. You know, what would you say if you walked into a church and you saw people there were speaking in tongues? What would you say if you walked in and you saw someone testify that they'd broken their hip, and all the people prayed for them, and then they went to the hospital, there was an x-ray, and lo and behold, there was no crack in the hip? What would you say? And she listed off all these things she'd seen in her church. Now, I may not accept those as any evidence of divine intervention, but what I learned was how that woman, why she believes, at the most basic level, she believes she's seen something extraordinary that she can't explain. And I respect that. And even though she wasn't as kind of targeted and kind of articulate in a way as the woman who gave the boat analogy, I knew she meant it. And that she was struggling herself to say, I can't believe you don't believe this. I am interested in believers. As an anthropologist in this book, my quest was to understand believers in their evangelizing capacity. And so for me, when I hear the honest account of extraordinary things that someone has seen, that helps me to understand.
Okay, we'll come back in just a minute, continue our conversation with John Marks. Stay tuned.
Where are you off to? Such a hurry, girl. There's something chasing you. What has you spinning round in circles, little girl? Is it the world or is it you? There's no use trying to stop this. There's no use trying to make it go away before you disappear. Just give it time.
And we're back with our guest, John Marks, the author and filmmaker. We were talking about various ways of evangelizing and things that have attempts that are made. I'm just curious, does it bother you, because it tends to bother people, and I'm curious, does it bother you when somebody says that you're going to hell, for instance? Or maybe you grew up in a church where that was talked about.
Yeah, I grew up in a church where it was talked about, and it bothers me now to hear it, and it's one of the central things that I grapple with when I talk with Christians. I think that that's a central question, not just for the spiritual implications of it, but for the political and social ramifications of it. If the Christian church hadn't persecuted so many people throughout the centuries in the name of that very doctrine, of that judgment, then it would be less of an issue. If people simply had believed it and it had never had any real-world consequences, then I would say, well, who doesn't believe? Who believes in anything, that there's a sort of hope and a joy, and then there's a punishment for those who don't participate in the hope and joy. But given that there has been so much misery inflicted in the name of that doctrine, it is, to me, it's a real issue, and it should be a real moral and ethical dilemma for Christians. And I'm not saying it should be a deal breaker, but I'm saying I think Christians should really have to wrestle with that on a daily basis, because the implications of it, if you take them then from the political and social realm and you put them into the spiritual realm, imply that Christians are committed to their own happiness and their own immortality, depending in some sense on the darkness, subjugation, and terrorizing of enormous numbers of human beings throughout history. What does all that mean? Now, it's a mystery at some level. I think that part of my upbringing religiously was to say, God knows a lot more than we do. We take an enormous amount of information that we will never know in this life, and we put it over here. One pastor in the book, when we were talking about the question of evil, which is sort of what we're getting to here, said, well, here's one way to look at it. That there's a room in heaven in which all those answers reside. And you just say to yourself in this life, those questions will be answered when I get into that room. And they will be answered. But until I get to that room, I'm not going to have them answered, and that's okay. And what I told the pastor was, that's not good enough for me. It's not good enough for me because I'm taking for granted that that you're right, that those questions will be answered, that there is such a room. And I can't believe there is such a room. But I respected where he was coming from. I mean, I respect, in terms of theology, I respect the argument from mystery. I mean, people who are like me had come at the end of a century in which secular forces did a lot of the massacring. And that's not acknowledged enough, I think, by people like Harris and Hitchens. Sam Harris, who wrote The End of Faith, I think he actually makes the argument that Stalin belongs in the religious category. Well, to me, that's intellectually bankrupt, completely.
Hitler as well?
Hitler as well. Hitler would fall in that category because he used quasi-religious terms to foment his, to get the public whipped up. But that's not the same as believing in God. And for all those Christians who were persecuted under the Nazis and under Stalin, you have to say that is not an intellectually responsible or plausible argument to make. So I stand here as someone who is a secular, quote-unquote, secular person, a word that secular people never use for themselves. It only seems to be used in the religious context, so we can talk about that if you want. But for me, I have to wrestle with that. What does it mean that the 20th century was the bloodiest in history? What does it mean? What does it mean for my view of the world? But on the other side, there are these other questions.
But why should it bother us? For instance, I'm assuming a Muslim would say, I'm going to hell, because I'm not Muslim. But I'm okay with that. I still go about my day, and I'm not offended. I kind of hope that he would be true to his faith, and as long as he doesn't kill me or try to impose that or hasten the day of my judgment.
Right.
So shouldn't we be okay with consigning each other to hell and still be able to go out and have dinner together and have a good time, or should that really be a deal breaker that we can't hang out together because we think each other are going to hell?
No, I think we should be able to hang out at each other and think each other's going to hell. I totally agree with you
without
on
changing what we think.
Yeah,
about
I mean, we have to have room in this society to believe differently. I am not saying that Christians should change their beliefs, or I'm not going to have dinner with them. I'm not going to have a friendship with you if you continue to believe that I am going to hell and you are not. But what I am saying is that in any conversation we're going to have, I'm going to raise this point, and I'm going to expect some good answers. And you can say, well, I don't have to answer you. I don't really care to answer you. I don't care enough about you to answer you. Or you can say, okay, I'm going to try to answer you. What I think is not acceptable actually is the condition where we say, you're going to hell and I don't want to talk to you about it at all. And I'm not going to entertain your questions.
A one-way conversation.
The one-way conversation is the bad thing. I assume that people, and for instance, in my book I talk about a missionary who I meet, and in our mutually exclusive views of the world, she goes to hell in her own way. She dies and loses everything. She's just mortal. Yet in this life, she went to Iraq and she was shot 22 times. Her husband was killed in the same attack, and she will live the rest of her life with pieces of shrapnel coming out of her body. She lost fingers.
She survived being shot 22
She survived
times?
being shot 22 times. She now travels around the country talking about this experience, and she believes that, of course, it served a higher end and that she will have all her questions answered when she's face-to-face with God. I don't believe that her God exists. I don't know that she will ever find that experience redeemed eternally. So that's a kind of hell for her. If what I'm saying then is, well, I'm sorry for your loss, but what you did was an act of futility, and you lost everything in the name of it, and it will never be redeemed. And you may have to live, if I'm right, with the notion that what your husband died for and what destroyed the person you love most in the world was nothing but a lie. Okay, that's hell, right? In her hell, it happens after. And I may live a perfectly happy life here, but I'll pay for it later if I don't accept Christ as my personal Savior. Both of those, if it's a zero-sum game, are mutually exclusive. You can't have it both ways. My argument in the book is that, at the very least, we have to acknowledge that and talk about it. There has to be a public space where those two totally different realities can be aired and two sides can challenge each other outside of a rancorous and poisonous atmosphere. But also, I think there's probably a third way of understanding both stories in which it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. You know, there is a broad range of experience. There are many ways to experience this world. There are many mansions, to use the theologically appropriate term here. But I don't think she has to believe like I believe, and I don't have to believe like she believes.
What do you do with, I'm sure that you must have come across some believers who will say, well, you are eternally secure. So it doesn't matter if you've changed your mind because you made a decision when you were 14. Nice try.
Right.
It's like when George Costanza tries to break up with that girl in Seinfeld and she's like, no, sorry, both guns have to fire at the same time.
Right.
So what if they say, sorry, both guns aren't firing, you can fire, but God's not letting you out of the deal?
I've heard that many times, and what I say is that's a belief that for you can work, but for me, it can't. And so it would be intellectually dishonest for me to say, hey, that's what I got going, just between you and me. You know, so I just, that's a belief that I understand, that once in, you're sealed for good. Don McQuinney felt that way. But I can't, it's hard to know what to do with that except to say, well, I respect your belief.
There's a powerful moment in that Ben Stein film, Expelled, when Richard Dawkins makes a very articulate and actually technically accurate description of God as sort of misogynistic, and he orders children to be killed and all these. He goes to these descriptors.
Right.
And I remember seeing that going, you know, technically that's accurate.
Right.
You know, the spin may be a little one-sided, but I thought that was a powerful moment for unbelief, if you will.
Right.
What are the arguments that are that you were most, so let's say, susceptible to, or that most get you in the middle of the night and think, you know, that's powerful? Are there any arguments that are
For
more
belief?
effective for belief on the other side of the coin?
Yeah. The 3 o'clock in the morning moment when you wake up, and when I wake up and I think about my child, and I think about my wife, and I think about my parents, and I think about all the people in my life, and I think about the idea that this is one moment in the night of time, and when it's done, it's done. You know, the fragility of life, particularly when I'm basically not quite awake and not quite asleep. I begin to, and my, you know, as a writer, my imagination is that is how I interpret the world, and I begin to feel that viscerally what that means, and I begin to sort of have this sort of hauntingly large picture of what that reality is, trying to think in terms of, as the ancient Greeks did, about this sort of simple moment when human beings sort of rise up and exist in all their glory before flashing out, and not how Plato believed necessarily, but that's my sort of sense of that sort of Homeric idea. That, for me, is a moment where I feel the urge to believe. Those moments when I see something miraculous and amazing. I mean, when I saw my son born, you know, I was blown away by that. I felt that as a natural event, and I don't really need anyone to tell me that there are miracles in this existence. That came to me as miracles seem to come to other people. It didn't seem to me spiritual in any religious sense, but it was completely spiritual in the sense that I felt that a different reality existed in that room. I was in the room when he was born, and I was there, and I helped the nurse deliver him, and that was, to me, I was outside of time in the sense that one thinks of God being outside of time. So those, to me, those moments are greater arguments. There's no intellectual argument that I've heard that's ever made me feel that God exists, but those experiential moments have brought me close to that feeling. The other thing that I will tell you is along the trail in this book, I had moments of community with Christians where I wanted to belong to that community. I wanted to feel what they were feeling. I wanted the solidarity of that fellowship. And denying it myself was painful. But I did get that there's a special kind of community that happens with faith that maybe doesn't happen, or doesn't happen in the same way that community does with people without faith. But that doesn't mean that that other way is sort of darker and more corrupt and less valuable. I think a key lesson for me has been trying to grapple with, even as a non-believer, that there is purpose and life abundant and meaning on the side of non-belief. You know.
Okay. We'll come back in a moment for our final segment with John Mark. Stay tuned. And we're back for one last segment on the Bully Pulpit Show, where everybody gets to, our guests get to stand behind the Bully Pulpit and give their views and their opinions. And today, John Marks is doing that. And John, we were talking about religion and the community feeling that you felt along the way. Why is it, do you think, that agnostic or maybe atheist Americans haven't been able to come up with sort of fellowships? Like, why aren't there sort of churches on street corners of agnostics and atheists who get together once a week, don't believe in God, but maybe just get together and have community over, other issues or other things that would unite them?
Well, I think part of the problem is that the idea of secular America, from inside belief systems where God is prominent, conclude that there is one big thing called secular America, which is a community of sorts. But in fact, that does not exist. There is no secular America. There are a tiny number of people who think of themselves as agnostic or atheist, and that is a primary way they have of thinking about each other.
It's about 8%, I think.
Tiny, maybe even less than that. Okay. A tiny percentage, and those people do find they come together in groups, free-thinking societies, atheist societies, but they're a tiny number. I think most people who consider themselves agnostic or atheist or whatever, it's not even, the key thing to understand is it's a question almost of indifference to them. It's not so much that they actively assert that they don't believe or they only believe a little, it's that they don't really care about those questions and that their lives are lived in a more material sense, and even their spirituality comes through nature, or it comes through their children, or it comes through sex, or it comes through other things. And there are communities for those things. They're just not communities that invoke God. And some of those communities, I think, have a large spiritual component. You will find people who, for instance, are secular Jews or secular, or people who come out of a religious tradition and don't really want the church of their youth, but want some kind of community where spirit is a component. So they'll get together every so often for barbecues or something, and they'll find in their lives together some kind of meaning. But I think it's a problem of society without God that it is harder to form community, that there tends to be an atomizing, not always, because what you have are large networks of friends, and just basic friendship becomes one of the ways that people find that meaning. They value their friends in the way that maybe they don't have a reason to value them that is supernatural, but they value them intentionally because they are closer to those friends are closer to them than family.
Is it hard to organize for something that you say doesn't exist? Is that the problem? That it's just kind of a weird way to organize each other?
Yeah,
like,
I mean, it's
we're all
like,
gathered because we don't believe something doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's like building your whole community around a negative.
Right.
How do you do that?
Right. So you find common points of interest that have nothing to do with the issue of theism or atheism, and you gather around those issues.
Right, exactly. Book clubs.
What about a Unitarian church? Would that interest you in where you're coming from?
I don't really seek, and
I'm just curious.
I know that there's a lot of that in New England.
Broad, yeah.
Like just Unitarians, where you have a little bit of everything, sort of an omnibus. No, the truth is that whatever spiritual satisfactions I find, I tend to find them individually. When I seek company and the company of others, I don't seek a spiritual component there. I seek spirituality if I seek it at all, through writing, through my art. That is where I have my encounter with the largest questions of being. I have it with my wife. I think sexual experience is a place where a lot of people find spirituality in the secular world. Mm-hmm. I think the natural world, walking by myself. If I have thoughts of the larger picture, it's often while I'm walking down the bike path going to work or riding my bike. When I'm seeking the company of others, there are just other things that guide that. And actually, those are the very situations where God will almost never come up.
I'm guessing if you were a very religious person, let's say Tim LaHaye, and you have secular thoughts, or you decide you want to move away from that, it'd be very hard if you've built your career upon theism, let's say.
Yeah.
What about for you? Now that you've written this book and you've made this publicly, very known, would it be difficult, and would you be able to follow a path that led to belief, or would you feel like you were going against the fans you've built up or the following, or could you go on a journey like that if it came later?
Well, I'm one of those perverse types who would probably do it just to spite my fans or following. I kind of have to sort of feel that this isn't, even though it's a public declaration, It is also a very personal and individual declaration. I am not trying to guide people to a decision here. If that happens, I'll take the responsibility of it that is mine, but I'm not setting out to do that. I'm not being a missionary from my view of the world.
But it'd be hard for Dawkins to tomorrow
Yes, I think it
tell
would.
the world, I just met Jesus.
And yet I think Dawkins is much more likely to be the one who does that than I am. I think principled atheists are always exactly the ones who are in the most danger of actually going to the other side, because they've staked out such an extreme position.
Because they're fundamentalists in a different way.
They're fundamentalists in a different way. I think it's just like those old line leftists from 1968 who at some point became...
David Horowitz types.
Exactly. A friend of mine says, once a Stalinist, always a Stalinist. And I sort of think there's some truth to that. I think that for me, trying to honestly find my way forward with these big questions, if I came to a point where I honestly could find no other explanation for what I was going through than to say, I actually believe in God, then I would do that. But I don't want to be committed to people I don't know just because I've publicly declared myself to be in one place.
Let's talk about Purple State of Mind.
Yeah.
This is a documentary you did with your friend Craig Detweiler.
Yes.
You guys went to college together.
Right.
He became he continued, I guess, down the path of some brand of evangelical Christianity.
Yes.
And you went on your path, and you got together and did this film. What's it about?
So when I sold the book to HarperCollins on Christianity, I called up Craig pretty quickly because we had been roommates together and because that was the year when I started to pull away. And he was a born-again Christian just in. Craig always says his first year in the faith and my last. Not quite true, but it's sort of a handle for looking at how that happened. And what we wanted to do when we got together, I wanted to interview him not on camera. But when I called him, he said, yes, I'll sit down and talk with you, but I'd like to do this on camera, because he's a filmmaker and he wanted to see what would happen if we sat down and did this sort of publicly in that way. So we shot 3 hours of conversation, and the question was, is this just a vanity project or does this have any value for anybody outside ourselves? And we showed it to a few people, and then consensus seemed to be, there's something here, let's keep doing this. So we had 4 conversations over the course of a year. Every conversation has kind of a different tone. The first conversation that we did is really us catching up. We parted ways as friends after I left the faith, and we didn't talk for many years. And when we got back together again, we didn't talk about this stuff. I mean, this was about 10 years after I last saw him. I saw him again in Los Angeles, and we sat down, we had a cup of coffee, and the friendship was rekindled. But we didn't go back and talk about faith because it was a little bit too painful. It was all bound up with why we hadn't been friends for all those years. For this, it was time to go back in and do it. So the first conversation was the chronology. Who were we then? Why did you choose this? And why did I choose that? And what are the ramifications of that? Another conversation is the moment where we really have it out over the differences in our belief systems, and that gets pretty heated. There's some anger in that conversation. Another conversation, we go back to our alma mater and talk about the specific thing that Craig said to me that was decisive in driving me out of the faith, which he did. Craig made a comment to me. He told me when we were sophomores together, as I was acting and trying to write, he said, God doesn't like artists because they ask too many questions. So for me, at a ripe young age, where I'm trying to decide whether I'm going to be an artist, he actually made it the choice between faith and art. And I knew, as I say in the film, basically where I was, if that was really the choice. Now, by the time I left, that really wasn't the issue. But Craig's very blunt statement had an impact. And so he spends a lot of the movie, or a piece of the movie, saying, I'm sorry, I was wrong. So the conversation is an attempt to acknowledge our differences, not to say, like Rodney King, can't we all just get along, but to say, we really disagree. We are raising our children differently. We see the universe differently, and it leads us to different conclusions, but we are friends, and the bond matters profoundly. So how do we preserve the bond and acknowledge the difference? And for us, the answer is conversation, but honest conversation, vulnerability, not trying to trash or mock the other side, although I do a little bit of trashing and mocking, because I have to say, I think that should also be a part of the conversation. I think that in any honest conversation, people should be able to use their wit and to strike out and try to score points that way. If they can be funny, let them be funny. I think there should be room for anger and even rage, but it should all be within the bounds of a space where that can all happen. Now, it's very hard to do. It's easy to say and hard to do, and it took us a year. So this is 4 conversations, and the last conversation, we really get down to brass tacks.
What do you imagine your final moments. Let's
Right.
say we all are going to die. When you're passing over, what is your hope of sort of what your first, or will there be a conscious thought that's in the next life, or is there a next life, or what do you see happening that moment, or what do you see, or what do you hope, or what do you anticipate?
A huge silver explosion and blast off into the unknown.
And just consciousness or not consciousness?
I don't really know. If matter is not destructible, then in that moment when matter is being transformed, when a person dies, I assume there's some component of energy. Now I'm talking now in a very scientific way, but that's a point where energy and spirit probably meet. And I don't want to go any further than that because I really don't know, but I do have this feeling that even for those of us who don't believe at all in that there is anything out there, that we know so little about the nature of the energy that is in the universe and the way that that ties to our sense of spirit, that I'm assuming that there will be a moment that is, even for those who don't believe anything, that feels like divine fire.
Reincarnation?
I can't subscribe to reincarnation. Again, it just strikes me as a roadmap for something that I can't know about. I listen with interest to people who talk about reincarnation, but for me it's more interesting as a literary conceit than as a reality. I like the storytelling aspect of reincarnation.
Do you ever play out an oh crap scenario when God is there and you're like, oh, think about, oh shoot?
Yeah, I do, and my response is, you've got a lot of answers to give me. I have a lot of questions. So before you turn me into a burnt matchstick, let's hear it. Show me the room. At least do that.
Dawkins has a great line quoting Bertrand Russell about that, sir, you hid yourself from me so well over those years.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, John, it's great to have you. Thank you
Thanks,
so
Mike.
much
Thank
for
you
joining
having me.
And thank you for joining us as well on the Bully Pulpit Show. We'll see you next time for another edition with another guest behind the Bully Pulpit. We'll see you then.